So a really good starting point for beginning to explore the ideological dimensions of media is to think about media as a form of culture. Now, what we mean here, when we talk about media as culture, what we're talking about is both a concrete thing, so you can watch a television program on TV, you can watch a television program on your phone or iPad or computer. So it's a thing, you know, you listen to music, you read a magazine, you read a newspaper. So we're talking about things, but we're also talking about, when we talk about culture, we're also talking about a way of life. We're also talking about a way of thinking about the world. So the media, when we talk about media as culture, we're talking about the media as concrete things, but also as things which have an impact on the way we think about the world and the way we live our lives. And there are 5 important features of thinking about the media as culture, and what I'd like to do is explore these in a little more detail, just so you understand the way in which media operates as culture and the complexity of media. Now, you're probably now sort of, we're more than halfway through the unit, have a really strong understanding that media texts are complex things. But let's review that and see how media products influence not the way we see the world and how that operates. So culture, as I've said, is physical. It's a thing. It's a newspaper. You know, even if you're watching something or interacting with something on social media, you're still doing it on a device. You're still holding something in your hand, if it's your phone or your, tablet or laptop, or you're sitting in front of something. In the case of, it might be a desktop computer. So culture is physical. But as I've said, it's also, or I've indicated rather, it's also rhetorical. So once again, we know that we create meaning from media texts because we draw on a series of shared codes, conventions, and ways of understanding the world. So when we talk about culture as being rhetorical, that's what we're referring to. We're referring to those shared codes and conventions that allow us to make sense of the world. So here we've got a collection of men, famous men, celebrities. Most of them are actors, but we've got Justin Trudeau, politician there, some musicians, but generally famous people, celebrities, and we look at them here and we identify them, or we recognize them as cool. Now, cool is one of those really interesting terms. No one actually knows what it means, but you know it when you see it. So in other words, a term like cool, so to look at this collection of men here and go, yeah, they're really cool, is based purely on convention. We know what we're talking about, but if we were to try and articulate it, we'd really struggle. So culture as a series of rhetorical devices, a series of shared codes and conventions, allow us to universally, even if we don't particularly like these people as actors, politicians, musicians, whatever, we look at them and go, yeah, they're universally recognized as cool people. And of course, what allows us to do that, what allows us to understand the fact that those guys in the previous slide were cool, is the fact that we make meaning from media texts socially. So culture is social and collective. It doesn't necessarily have to be such an extreme version of collectivity as you see here, sort of at Comic-Con or you know, a comic book science fiction convention like this. But it can be something as mundane as talking about The Bachelor or The Bachelorette in the tea room at work, or doing it online, or talking about what movies you've seen lately with your friends. So we make meaning always in a social context, where, you know, we very rarely do it by ourselves. And in fact, you know, if we accept that the media constructs reality, then the meanings we make from media don't exist unless we express them socially. So there's an inherent sociability to culture. It's a lived practice. It's a lived practice. Culture is also historical. And that means that the interpretations, the meanings that we associate with particular media texts, with particular media genres, will change over time, because we know that the world is a very fluid, ever-changing place, and media is impacted by other social forces. So the example I've used here is of punk. So punk is kind of a subculture, a musical genre, a kind of way of looking at the world, a way of dressing, thinking about the world that's been around since the mid-70s. So punk sort of emerged onto the cultural scene in around about 1976, with the Sex Pistols in the UK. And it's been a movement, it's been a subculture pretty much ever since. And what that means is that over time, the meaning of punk, the understanding of punk changes. So when we look at the Sex Pistols on our left, we think about, or they express, a very different version of punk compared to Green Day on our right. So that doesn't mean that any one version is better than the other. What it simply means is that they are different. And they are different because social media is impacted by social and cultural forces. And the big one here in relation to punk and punk music is the incorporation of punk into kind of mainstream culture. So the Sex Pistols were very much, you know, on the edge, on the fringes. They were radical, they were offensive, they were genuinely in that period kind of terrifying for audiences. But over time, the music became more popular. Other bands like The Clash popularized punk music, and now it's kind of, you know, pretty much a mainstay of the contemporary music scene. You know, everything from, you know, Green Day, Blink-182. Now the Sex Pistols would kind of be horrified at the thought of Green Day calling themselves punk and writing a Broadway musical, which they did. You know, they turned their American Idiot album into a Broadway musical. But, you know, we've got to avoid those sorts of value judgments when we look at culture as history, and just acknowledge that the different versions of culture are shaped by a whole range of forces. And that doesn't necessarily make, you know, one historical moment kind of more pure authentic than the other. It just means that they're different. And as analysts, we need to understand those differences. So finally, culture is attitudinal. In other words, culture is both shaped by and shapes how we look at the world. And we're probably more aware of that at this particular historical moment with the election of Donald Trump as president than perhaps ever before, because we're seeing very dramatically a whole series of attitudes displayed publicly, loudly, and very prominently. Now, what all of this means is that culture is ideological. So if we take everything that we've just looked at, we reach the conclusion that culture is ideological. And for our purposes, ideology refers to a system of ideas that unconsciously shapes and constrains our beliefs and behaviors. So ideology is a system of ideas that unconsciously shapes and constrains our beliefs and behaviors. For example, ideology impacts on how we define the world. Ideology impacts upon the things that we take for granted, the ideas, the beliefs, the attitudes that we take for granted. Ideology defines what is normal for us. And of course, by implication, it defines what is not normal. So ideology is an incredibly powerful force in influencing or teaching us to see the world in some ways rather than others, because it impacts on how we define the world. It shapes what we take for granted, and it helps define what we see as normal. And of course, media texts are central to disseminating ideology. Media texts are central to disseminating ideology. So now we've reached the point where our textual analysis, all the techniques that we've looked at over the past few weeks, we can now begin to employ in a way that allows us to expose the ideological systems, the ideological beliefs that are embedded in media texts. So when we talk about culture and ideology, what we're doing is that we're using semiotics, we're using textual analysis to unpack how the media defines the world, how the media shapes what we take for granted, and how the media helps define what is normal and not normal. What I'd like to do is give you 3 examples of this before we dig a bit deeper. So just to clarify or help clarify your understanding. So I want to focus on the 3 biggest commercial TV sitcoms from the past decade, I think it's fair to say, or maybe even going on 15 years now. The 3 shows that we're going to look at, all incredibly popular, whether on original runs or via repeats. And let's think about these sitcoms ideologically, just as a way of introducing the ideas to you. Now, I want to start with The Big Bang Theory. And Big Bang Theory, you can't miss it. It seems to be on every channel almost every night on repeat. So, whether you're looking at repeats or you're looking at the new series, it doesn't really matter. But I want to start with The Big Bang Theory. And the reason I want to start with The Big Bang Theory is because it relates to one of the ideas that were that was, sorry, expressed in the reading for this module, and it refers to the idea of madness and the way in which constructing someone as mad, crazy, mentally ill, however you want to define it, is in fact a product of ideology and is in fact a product of history. Now, let's just start from the point to begin with. The four main male characters are all, pretty weird. They're pretty weird. They're oddballs. If we, Sheldon Cooper is probably the oddest of them all. Whether he's got obsessive compulsive disorder, some form of autism, whatever. But the show makes it very clear that Sheldon is weird. We've got Raj to his left, who is completely incapable of talking to women unless he's drunk. So, he's got some serious social phobia. Howard Wolowitz on the extreme right, it's probably fair to say if you've watched an episode of the show, particularly the earlier series, his character should probably be a registered sex offender. There's some pretty dodgy stuff going on there. And of course, Leonard's probably the most normal, but still, he's very geeky, very nerdy, very socially awkward. Now, of course, they stand in contrast to Penny, who is the main female character, who is conventionally attractive, is not a scientist, lives in the real world, and is kind of the normal one in conventional terms. So if we take our understanding that I've just set up of the Big Bang Theory there and think about it in relation to what the reading for this week is saying about madness, craziness, social dysfunction as an ideology. Now, it makes the point that once upon a time, and I'm talking about the Middle Ages, really, from around the Middle Ages, people who were considered mad, crazy, mentally ill, whatever you want to call it, lived very happily and very unproblematically in society. They were the eccentric people, but they were not locked away. They were not treated as being abnormal. They were not necessarily seen as a problem. They just were. But mental illness, social dysfunction became recognized as a social problem around about the same time as the Industrial Revolution. So when people moved from being peasant farmers, working under a feudal system, and gravitated to being employed in factories in cities, then the idea of mental illness, of madness, became a problem, because the people who were classified as mad, mentally ill, insane, but socially dysfunctional were not economically productive. So these were the people who could not go and work in factories. So these were the people who were not any longer able to look after themselves. They relied on the state to look after them. In other words, they became a burden on the state. So hence, they became constructed as deviants, social outcasts, etc. Now, how does all of this apply to the Big Bang Theory? Well, the Big Bang Theory plays with that idea of social dysfunction, mental illness, being a bit crazy, and productivity, and turns it on its head completely, because the four main male characters, the four most socially dysfunctional, awkward, loopy, whatever you want to call them, and please, I'm using these terms flippantly to make a point, they're all super intelligent, super smart, work at universities, are scientists, are leaders in their field, and they are the ones who earn the money. Here, it's Penny, the normal person, who is the struggling wannabe actor who works at the Cheesecake Factory, who struggles to pay her rent while the four guys are able to spend money on action figures, movie memorabilia, and a whole range of toys. So Big Bang Theory can be thought of as ideological because it plays with and inverts that dominant way of looking at the world that social outcasts are somehow problematic and deviant because they're not able to be economically productive. Here we see a kind of celebration of geekdom, we see a celebration of awkwardness, largely because these guys are super smart and super productive, hence being able to earn far more money than the normal and socially functional Penny. Let's extend this ideological way of looking at the media to How I Met Your Mother. So the next two examples are really all about how marriage is valorized and celebrated as an ideological norm. Now, everything about How I Met Your Mother, from the name onwards, is about celebrating marriage. So the show really is about Ted Mosby's struggle and journey to find the perfect wife. And of course, the template for that is Marshall and Lily, who are already married and are kind of used in the show as beacons of the perfect couple. Even Barney and Robin, who are kind of the the party people. Barney's the playboy, Robin is the independent, intelligent woman who wants to forge her own way in the world. Eventually, even those two fall in love and end up getting married. They get divorced, but marriage suddenly becomes an ideal for them. So the key to the perfect life in How I Met Your Mother is finding, and notably here it's a heterosexual life partner through marriage. So marriage becomes kind of an unquestioned norm and a good thing to do, despite the fact that 50% of marriages end in divorce, of course. So How I Met Your Mother constructs a reality, constructs a version of, or constructs a way of thinking about marriage that is at odds with the reality of marriage in modern society. And of course, you can't talk about marriage in sitcom terms without thinking about Modern Family. Now, Modern Family is really interesting because at the heart of the show, of course, are three really diverse families. So you've got the Dumfies, who are kind of a very normal, conventional, 2.4 kids, well, 3 kids, but you know what I mean. Mum and dad, happily married, big house in the suburbs. They drive a Toyota, etc., etc. So that's the kind of traditional version. And certainly historically, it's been the traditional sitcom version of marriage. But of course, you've got a couple, a family, where there's a considerable age difference between the husband and the wife. And you've got same-sex marriage as well. Now, so there's absolutely an acknowledgement that families are diverse, don't necessarily conform to any kind of stereotypical ideal. That's absolutely the case with Modern Family. You know, it kind of lies, that idea of diversity lies at the heart of the show. But what Modern Family does that could be considered kind of problematic ideologically is that it argues that the family is the solution to all of life's problems. So every episode of Modern Family ends on a happy note with the family, some member of the family being able to solve a problem, a dilemma, the plot conflict. It all gets happily resolved within the family unit. And again, you know, that is completely at odds with the modern experience of family life. So we've got three really popular mainstream sitcoms, and what I've done here is tried to give a sense of the way in which these shows privilege certain ways of understanding, in this case, sort of what's normal, both in relation to sort of being socially functional, but also in relation to married life and family life. That's not to say these shows aren't funny. That's not to say these shows aren't entertaining. But sitting alongside of that is this understanding that we're going to explore, that contemporary media asks us to think about the world in particular ways that are quite often at odds with our own experience of the world.